Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 7. This is the week where we step outside the home and the family relations and we take a look at the first set of social institutions that people typically encounter when they leave their homes, which are schools and educational institutions. Oh, and speaking of leaving home, my cat has decided that she needs to be part of this as well. So you might hear the odd meow going on. So here's where we're going to go with this. I'm going to start with elementary and high school, kind of rolling those two together because those are the levels of education that are free and compulsory in most countries of the global north and indeed many parts of the global south as well. So the experience of going through elementary school and high school is something that we can presume is pretty widely shared. Post-secondary education is a bit more of a filter going on. Somewhere between 40 and 60% of Canadians, depending on how you count, hold post-secondary qualifications of some sort. So not everybody ends up there. It's a more privileged form of education, and it's usually tied much more directly to the pathways that one will take in adulthood than elementary or secondary school is. So we're going to talk about that in a different section. And then I want to end with a look back and a look forward. I just want to show you some kind of interesting and sort of fun things that I found out about some of U of A's history as a gendered institution, specifically the first women to attend U of A as students, the very beginning of the 20th century, and then looking ahead to what COVID might mean for the relationship between gender and education. And at this point, the short answer is nobody really knows yet. But I want to point to some lines of inquiry or some possible ways in which the COVID pandemic may intensify the gendering of education. So here we go. Elementary and secondary school. Now, when kids start in elementary school, they're not coming to the school just as sort of gender neutral human beings. They're coming into a world, an institution where they're already subject to um, expectations, to forms of assessment, both by parents and teachers, that take the perceived gender of the child, male or female or non binary, into account. So everybody, kids enter schools as gendered beings, and as they move through schools, the gendering intensifies. So let's take a look first at this idea that kids arrive in school into a place where certain expectations of how they will perform, what they will do, already exist by virtue of their gender. So we're going to talk about gendered expectations, focusing on the adults involved, the teachers and the parents. The research on gendered expectations of students, there's first, there's a lot of it. There's tons and tons of it. There's a few generalizations that we can draw from it. One is that even though most teachers, especially those who've become professionalized as teachers fairly recently, and most parents don't hold explicitly and overtly um, sort of gendered beliefs about the capabilities of boys and girls. Most teachers would say, I teach children, I don't teach boys one thing and girls another thing. I try not to see gender in my classroom. I treat kids alike. But yet the evidence is that these good intentions, these sort of aspirations towards a gender neutral world don't actually play out in the classroom, and that indeed, um, despite our best intentions as educators, as parents, we do treat kids differently according to what we understand of their gender. lot of research has suggested that boys are expected, it's considered normative for them to be very active, energetic, squirmy, can't sit still. Boys are all over the place. The idea that boys need correction, that it is in the nature of boys to be testing limits and pushing rules and so forth. And so, therefore, if a boy is having trouble or acting out, it's a situation where discipline is required, or some sort of intervention to keep him to the rules. That idea is fairly common in observational studies of teachers in classrooms. Boys get a lot more correction and disciplining than girls do. And this leads into the next regularity, which is that it's almost expected that boys will get into trouble, because boys will be boys. They'll do things, they'll go too far, they won't think about the consequences and so forth. And what this can produce is that behavior, you may have a boy and a non-boy exhibiting the same sort of behavior, but if the educator is operating kind of with these unconscious gendered biases, a boy's behavior might be read as a manifestation of this tendency to get into a bit of trouble, to push rules, to just be active, blow off steam. Whereas the same behavior might be interpreted differently if the educator is operating with a gender lens that understands girls to have certain characteristics, such as expecting that girls will be more quiet or compliant. This idea that when girls have trouble or are in distress, what they're in need of is help and support more than discipline and correction. This may remind you a bit of what we talked about last week with the way parents will provide different interpretations of the meaning of a baby crying, depending on whether they think the baby is a boy or a girl. Similar things get observed in schools where behavior is read as either disruptive and requiring discipline, or a sign of distress and requiring help and support, depending on the gender of the child. And there's also the expectation that girls basically will follow the rules. There's evidence, there's research suggesting that when you have girls who don't follow the rules, who break the same rules as boys do, that the discipline they receive is actually somewhat more severe, because not only are they transgressing against the rules of the classroom, they're also transgressing against expected norms for their gender. So kids come to school and they come into a gendered environment. What we've got here is a survey of parents' perceptions of their children's experiences in school. And this was from a big Statistics Canada survey of 9-year-olds, the kids themselves, and also the adults associated with them. So parents, teachers, whatnot. And what this shows is how parents responded in terms of agreeing or disagreeing with sets of statements about their child's performance in school, depending on the behavior of the gender of the referenced child, whether the referenced child they were being asked about was a boy or was a girl. And as you can see, there are some differences. So moving from the left of the screen, when the reference child was a girl, 80% of parents in this survey agreed with the statement, "My child is doing well at school," compared to just over 2/3 of the parents of reference boys agreeing with that statement. We see a gap opening in language arts. Parents who were talking about girls were much more likely to say, "My child is doing well in language arts," compared to parents of who were speaking about boy children, where they were only slightly more than 50% likely to say that they believed their child was doing well in language arts. Pretty close to even on math. And then the aspirational question, my child will attend university, agree, disagree. We see not a huge difference, but still a noticeable difference that parents were more likely to agree with that statement if the reference child um, in that case was a girl, suggesting that the expectation that girls will succeed in school and go on to do even more school is held by parents. Here's what some teachers had to say about students in grades 2 and 3. The NLSCY is the National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth, which is a recurring panel survey that Statistics Canada carries out. I'm looking at the title of the chart and I'm realizing I just left the words chart title in there, which should not be there. So we can forget about that. At any rate, what this shows is part of this survey was asking teachers, grade 2 and grade 3 teachers, to think about their classrooms and distribute the students in their classroom in achievement categories. So, which students do you put at the bottom of the class, all the way up to which students do you put into that category of top of the class? And then, when this was analyzed for the gender of the students, regularities, patterns emerged. So, the bottom of the class, on average, teachers put about 10% of the boys in their class in that sort of lowest academic category, compared to not quite 5% of girls. So twice as many boys as girls were deemed to be at the bottom of the class. As we move up through the achievement categories, you see the girls, we find more and more girls gradually until where they really exceed the number of boys is in the very top category, where 20 teachers put more than a quarter of their girl students in the highest category of top of the class, but only 15.5% of their boy students. So the teacher's perception, we can infer from this, was that their girl students were more academically successful, were higher achieving than their boy students. And this is at the grade 2 and 3 level. So this differential perception according to gender of the student seems to start fairly early in kids' academic careers. We see something similar when we look at gender ratios in terms of kids who are identified as having a challenge that affects their ability to learn, or having a behavioral concern that affects their ability to learn. Now, these ratios are starting to change, partly because many girl students who sort of flew under the radar, partly because of this presumption that girls, are going to be quiet and compliant, and were never identified as potentially having a learning issue or a learning disability, are now being identified, so that therefore appropriate supports and so forth can be put in place. So this is in flux. But the overall pattern remains the same. Boys are much more likely than girls to receive referrals to psychologists based on behavior in an education setting, to be diagnosed as hyperactive or diagnosed as having a learning disability, to end up in special behavioral programs, to be suspended or kicked out of high school, and to have to be required to do a grade over again. So there's something going on in schools with boys, such that we're seeing a lot more boys encountering these challenging circumstances than we are girls. And that brings us to the question of gendered achievement gaps. How are boys and girls doing in school? Achievement gaps have been the subject of a lot of educational research. Initially, the concern was about gaps between boys and girls in math and science, where girls were underperforming relative to boys. And over the last few decades, lots of research, lots of resources and support has gone into this to close this gap in math and science. You may be familiar with some of the STEM-related programs that are meant to encourage girls into STEM-related fields. U of A has Wisest, which maybe some of you have come through. And that's overall, that's been a success story. Girls' performance in math and science has improved a great deal over the last couple of decades, suggesting that um, it wasn't an innate problem or deficiency in girls that meant that was making them underperform relative to boys, but it had something to do with their educational environments. Where we're at now is a bit different. So math and science achievement gaps, um, depending on what study you look at, sometimes we still see a slight advantage for boys, particularly in higher levels in secondary school. Other times it's a wash. Girls and boys are performing equally well in math and science, especially in school systems such as Alberta's, which actually is a really good public school system where you don't see much of a gender gap really at all compared to school systems that aren't as good. As sort of a rule of thumb, the more successful the school is overall, the smaller the gender gaps are going to be. Where math and science gaps do exist, the magnitude of the gap is small. It's a matter of a couple of percentage points. We're no longer seeing these big differences between girls and boys in that regard. And the gap shows up where it does show up, if it shows up, mainly in standardized tests rather than in class grades. And the significance of this is that with classroom grades, the teacher who is giving the marks, who's grading the students, knows the students, so you can't ever like remove that element of knowing who is who in a particular class. While with standardized tests like the provincial achievement tests, it's some computer somewhere that's grading the tests. And so the possibility that gender biases might be influencing outcomes is not, is not there. So math and science gaps, where they exist, that doesn't happen in grades. Teachers grading students in their classroom seem to, there's not really showing any discrepancy, but occasionally it shows up in standardized tests. Language arts, on the other hand, is where the concern about gender gaps today resides. Gender gaps in language arts tend to favor girls. Girls tend to do better than boys. The magnitude of these gaps is not that small. Can be a few percentage points or a lot of percentage points. Language arts gaps tend to turn up pretty much from the beginning of elementary school onwards. If you start comparing girls and boys, you see the girls outperforming the boys from early onwards. And they seem to appear in grades as well as tests, which means that classroom teachers, as well as, generic computers somewhere, are perceiving or are assessing girls as doing better than boys in this regard. To put it all into context, though, it's important to remember that gender gaps, where they exist, are only one of the many forms of gaps associated with socioeconomic differentiation. And the gaps between girls and boys in terms of achievement are actually small compared to the gaps between, say, rural students and urban students, or the achievement gaps between students from lower income families versus students from high income families. So we're talking about gender because that's what this class is about, but it's important to just contextualize it. Gender gaps are not the biggest inequality problem facing elementary and secondary schools today. The question of the why in language arts, why does it appear that girls are doing better than boys in activities that require reading and writing? Nobody has the answer, but here's a few of the ideas that have been put forth. One is the possibility that girls outperform boys in these areas because girls do more unrequired or recreational reading. Girls will read for pleasure. They'll buy books, with their allowance. They'll trade books back and forth with friends and so on. Whereas in sort of boys' friendship cultures, that doesn't happen as often. One of the big things, this is a bit of a side point, but when the Harry Potter books started appearing, one of the reasons that they were such a big sensation is because boys would voluntarily read these books. They were as popular with boys as they were with girls, which was really unprecedented for a kids a series. So that, Harry Potter is kind of credited with like jump starting literacy for, lots of young boys who otherwise were not really reading a whole lot for enjoyment or pleasure. Other researchers have said, no, it's not a matter that girls read and boys don't read, but they read different things. Girls' reading choices tend to align fairly closely with what gets tested in schools. You think of what, reading comprehension and literature in schools, it tends to be narrative, short stories, novels, plays, maybe. And some scholars of reading have pointed out that boys read a lot, but much of what they read is not narrative. It's Guinness Book of World Records. It's how to do this, that, and the other. It's forms of literature that schools still don't really incorporate into curriculum as much, like manga or anime or comics. And that if we looked at reading more holistically, and looked at, all the reading that boys and girls do, they actually do read a lot. It's just certain forms of written texts are valorized more in schools as indicating a high level of competence than others. Teacher expectations may play a role here as well. Teachers, it's well established. You have high expectations and kids will rise towards them. You have low expectations and kids will also meet those expectations. So teachers' belief that girls are capable of a lot in language arts and encouraging girls and emphasizing to them that they're good at this may play a role. And the same thing goes with parental encouragement. If parents encourage boys as well as girls to read a lot and write a lot, and make it clear that this is a desirable thing to do and a good thing to do, that will shape gendered patterns in reading and writing competence. There's some fascinating parenting research on birthday and Christmas gifts that seems to indicate that girls are much more likely than boys to receive books as gifts, on special occasions, which, tells you something about the importance that parents put on reading, or that, how they see their child as a reader. So looking at all of this, one might be tempted to say there is a crisis with boys in schools. They're having, if we just break it down by gender, it looks like boys have more behavioral and conduct issues. Their achievement gaps exist. Parents and teachers have somewhat lower expectations for boys than they do for girls. The important thing to realize is that this is one of those situations where focusing only on gender is going to mean that you sort of lose a more complex picture. So, not when we talk about boys who are underperforming in schools relative to girls, um, we're not talking about all boys and all girls. What we're talking about is a situation where gender intersects with other forms of social identification or social category to intensify gaps between boys and girls. So when we look at things like economic status, like racialization, like disability, that's where we see the real gender gaps opening up. It's as for boys who come from families that are not well off, or boys who are uh, members of racialized groups, or boys who come to school with a disability, that in conjunction with gender seems to produce a gender gap which favors girls. So we can think of this boy crisis not as a gender thing, but as an intersectional crisis, gender intersecting with other categories. As Hightower, who's an American educational scholar, puts it, boys who are sort of hegemonically masculine, they're white, they're heterosexual, they're able-bodied, they're middle class, they're traditionally masculine, tend to do quite well. So boys who have characteristics that associate them with a fair bit of privilege in American and Canadian society, school is not a minefield for them. They tend to perform quite well. It's the boys who do not fit this privileged, hegemonically masculine uh, framework who are the ones who are most at risk for negative outcomes, whether that be through achievement or underachievement, or conduct and behavioral issues, or what have you.